So this is something really cool. The wife and I decided to stain our deck, and we started putting applying the oil-based stain with a sponge. Unbeknownst to us that we left it out in the sun, so it started generating its own heat from external source and started to spontaneously combust. When it started getting hot to the touch, I threw it in the grass so that way I thought it would cool down, but it's actually generating its own self temperature, and it's now decomposing with the chemical reaction of the oil and the chemicals with the sponge. It is now actually creating its own heat source and smoldering. So I thought I'd kind of shoot this little video and show you what that would look like with spontaneous combustion on a time delay in a hot summer sun when you're using oil-based stains. This is why when people aren't careful with what they're doing in incompatibilities of chemicals, out like in summertime, especially with oil-based chemicals that can heat up with the sunlight and hot temperatures, this is how things would catch on fire. And this is why people that put things on wood decks, especially poly decks, when they're just smoldering away, end up turning into house fires. And actually the smoke is kind of irritable right now because it is oil-based, but that suckers just keep smoking. I'm going to let this thing burn, and so I can show the wife. And otherwise, this is why we got to be very careful what we're working with. The other thing too, going back to product self-combusting or spontaneous ignition, this is one of the many important reasons why you have stuff that's petroleum-based that generates its own self-heat. This is why we don't throw rags that are oil-soaked in with garbage, because it will self-generate its own heat when there's pressure or just atmospheric temperatures. And this is what ends up happening while they have trash can fires in machine shops, garages that belong to somebody, personal owned garages, and they just throw these things away without letting them cool down or rinsing or diluting them before throwing them away. Okay, this is what happens when you add more air and oxygen to rags that are oil soaked. I actually blew my own breath on it, and it created its own heat source, putting more toxic smoke out. And this was probably within 2 minutes time after I started blowing on it. It's amazing what happens. So if this thing was contained, this thing is totally oil soaked with the oil-based stain, and this is what it tends to happen. And this is actually in the shade right now. It's about 80 degrees, but this thing, with a little bit addition of blowing air and accelerating the air, it rapidly decomposes and turns into this. So after about 2 to 3 minutes after ignition, the actual sponge pad is still burning. The flame has lost its intensity, but with the fuel, which is the oil-based stain, is still saturated. It's still actually off-gassing and burning, as we see here. After 7 minutes, this is what it's come down to. It's still pretty hot to the touch, but it's completed burning. It's just smoldering back again. It's decomposed. So this is what happens when you're not careful using oil-based products with organic materials like rags,